Hello, my name is Alison Sayers and I'm the Safeguarding Trainer for Education. I have been asked to deliver a training session on a safeguarding issue, namely around children who have family members in prison. This is one of the specific safeguarding issues that all staff need to have an awareness of, as families may be in need of extra support, and because of this we all need to be mindful of the need for thinking about early help for such families. This is a short presentation aimed at providing you with some of the statistics around families who have a family member in prison, the impact of an arrest, the subsequent detention of a family member in prison, and the effect that this may have on a child. We will look at the financial impact, the education impact, and also the practical impact on the child and how we can assist. So just to get you started and get you thinking, I'd like you to attempt this short quiz. It's only got 6 statements, but they are true or false answers. So if you'd like to record your answers down for me, and then once you've finished, we'll go on to the next slide, which will have the answers, so no cheating, please. As this has been recorded in COVID, I have no way of knowing whether you're able to do this quiz or any of the work in a group, or whether you're doing this in isolation on a screen on your own. But these are the answers to the quiz, and you'll see that 95% of children and young people whose mum goes to prison have to actually leave the family home. That is absolutely true, which means that 5% of children only stay at home. So that's an awful lot of children that have so much upheaval. They may have to live with a parent that they've had potentially not much access to. They may have to live with grandparents. They may even have to go into foster care or be adopted, dependent on the length of time that that parent is in prison. So not only do they have the upheaval of having their mum go to prison, but they also then have perhaps a change of area, a change of school, maybe with that change of school come different friendship groups, etc. So just think about the upheaval that that child has to go through. Question 2, or quiz number 2 if you like, say that an estimated 5 in every 100 children experience their father's imprisonment. That's absolutely false. It's actually 7 in every 100 children that experience their father's imprisonment. So I think you'll agree with me that's quite high. Statement number 3, 3 times as many children have a parent go to prison than they do get their parents being divorced. Now that is true. That astounded me, because I thought that there would be more children whose parents get divorced, but actually we're looking at something like 312,000 children have their parents go to prison, or a parent go to prison, whereas 100,000 roughly per year have their parents get divorced. So the figures are quite high for children whose parents go to prison. Nearly half of prisoners lose contact with their family whilst in prison, which is true. And again, it shows that really we need to try and make sure that our prisoners have contact with families, especially their children, because you'll see in question 6 that those who have visits from their family are less likely to reoffend and more likely to get accommodation and employment when they leave prison. So prisons are acting to try and make sure that prisoners have visits. That's incredibly difficult during lockdown, because unfortunately prison visits are suspended and virtual sessions that are held are subject to cancellation at short notice. So you have families that are really excited about seeing their parent virtually because they can't access a prison visit in person, that then may have half an hour beforehand just a notification that that visit isn't taking place. 500,000 visits to prisons by children in England and Wales, absolutely true. And again, you know, I've been to prison, not personally, I have to say, but I did a prison visit to an open prison in Redditch about 2 years ago now. We talked to prisoners who were there. They'd been in, some of them a long time, others shorter periods of time, but those prisoners were dads, and they very much valued the prison visits that they were allowed in a family centre on site. A lot of them identified that being in prison and the lack of contact that they'd experienced with their children was a real positive thing, that when they got outside they didn't want to reoffend. So that lack of contact with their children had prompted a change perhaps in their thought processes, I guess making them feel that they didn't want to be incarcerated again, and hopefully that will prevent reoffending in the future. This slide provides us with statistics from Spurgeon's and also NICO, which is the National Information Centre of Children of Offenders, and these are the most up-to-date statistics that we have. The top statistic we discussed in the last slide, and I'm sure you'll agree those statistics are quite high, 312,000 children. Potentially those children are in our schools that have a parent in prison in England or Wales. The 10,000 visits by children every week to prisons is pre-COVID. And as we discussed in the previous slide, that means that these children are not getting access to their mum or their dad in prison except by a virtual contact, and those virtual contacts we know are much reduced because of staffing issues, etc. The 29% of persons experience abuse as a child relate to offenders. So those offenders in prison, a lot of them, nearly a third of them, have already experienced abuse in their childhood. And if we think about ACEs and the prevalence of ACEs, that counts as an adverse childhood experience. 37% of prisoners having a family member who've had already been convicted of a crime. Again, high. Over a third of prisoners have already had contact with somebody who's already been convicted of crime and may already have had to go on to visit that person within an institute. So think about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. What we know is that people who experience abuse as a child, those that have family members already in prison, those are two ACEs to start with, and think of the emotional impact that this will have on children. When we look at this slide, you can see that children of prisoners are more likely to have behavioural problems and show antisocial behaviours. You'll see they're 3 times more likely to develop behavioural problems, twice as likely to show that antisocial behaviour. And when we look at the statistic of prisoners who've actually been suspended or temporarily excluded from school in their past, we can see the impact on children who have a family member in prison is substantial. Now, that might be because the caregiver that's left has that feeling of loss, perhaps bereavement even if that family member has gone to prison for a long time, and maybe has lack of support systems around them, maybe having that overwhelming feeling of not being able to cope. And we know that children need those boundaries in place, the support, the reinforcement of self-esteem to become resilient. So the lack of protective factors there will have a significant impact on children as they grow up. When we look at the number of children affected by maternal imprisonment, we're looking at 17,000 children per year. And from that previous statistic, we know that 95% of those children will be forced to leave that maternal home. So again, quite alarming statistics, I think, there. The next 2 slides are actually children's comments that have been taken from a document in NICO. The first quote talks about an incident and a boy actually who knew about that incident being really quite cruel and nobody actually doing anything about it, just laughing about it. So it's really important that we as education staff are aware of the possible implications for children and the comments that are made, and how's that going to make them feel in a classroom situation. The second comment on there is about a child that didn't even know that their father was going to prison. They saw it in the newspaper. They didn't really know anything about it, but other people did. How difficult must that be for that child, not even knowing that their parent was going to prison? What would that feel like? How would it make you feel if that had happened to you? And not really knowing anything, and then people staring at you and perhaps giggling at you or putting you down for something you don't really understand. These three quotes seem to suggest how the child is feeling. In the top one, the child suggesting that they'd be happy once the parent is home, the insinuation being that they can't be happy until that individual comes back into her life or his life. The second one being naughty at school and angry. Maybe that's because they can't cope with the situations with people around them. If it's a secret that they're holding inside that nobody knows about, how can they talk to anybody? And that's illustrated in that third quote where the child says, I don't really talk to anybody, just my mum. How lonely must that be? And how devastating is that for a child? These are all perfectly normal responses because this is a significant event in a child's life. Remember, we talked about the ACEs, and having a parent or child in prison is one of those ACEs. When a person is arrested, that's a significant issue anyway. But think about how that must feel for a child who may be present at home when an arrest is actually made by the police. It may be that access is refused, and in that case the police would have to force entry to the address. If a firearm is believed to be used, then that will be with a firearms team present. How frightening might that be for that child with a gun being pointed in their direction or at the offender, their parent or carer? And if that person resists arrest, they will see that person potentially put to the floor, handcuffed. There might be the use of dogs to use to effect that arrest. In any case, the whole family home would be searched from top to bottom, dependent on what the arrest is about. If it's for drugs, you'll have sniffer dogs used. And that might mean that all the child's belongings are searched. Think how distressing that must be for a child to actually witness. The child might actually be in the middle of town when an arrest is effected. And think about the shame or the stigma attached to that, because if somebody from their school is there witnessing that, or a neighbour, how distressing and embarrassing must that feel? If the child isn't even present at the arrest or even told about it, and then faces other people who are saying, oh, what happened at your house yesterday? Think about again the impact and the worry that that child would go through. So this is significant for a child, especially if they're present. If a child is aware that their parent has gone to prison, they may have many emotions to deal with, and some of those I've listed on this slide. The child may show shock or signs of disbelief, or even laughter, and think that the person telling them is actually joking. They may sob and be very, very upset, or even switch onto autopilot and try and carry on as normal, pretending that nothing really has happened. It's important to actually reassure a child that what they're feeling, maybe numbness or disbelief, is normal, and reassure them that you're there for them and will listen to them. Again, important when you are talking to children to keep your language clear and simple, so the child can easily understand what is being said to them. The child may be in denial and pretend nothing has happened, and because of this they may lie about the situation to others and themselves. They may get really angry, frustrated. They may lash out at themselves and the world, blaming others for what's happened. They may also overreact over the smallest thing, overreaching, lashing out at others, using their anger to cover up their hurt or sadness. Again, they might try and bargain. They might try and make a deal to change the situation. For example, if dad and mum come back, I'll be good forever, because that's their thought process. On the other hand, they might feel guilt. They might blame themselves for that family member's imprisonment. And equally, they might feel they can't enjoy anything because they feel they shouldn't be happy if mum and dad is in prison. For example, I can't eat an ice cream because my mum and dad can't have one there. Again, think about depression and that child becoming very withdrawn and sad, constantly crying and not wanting to, or even refusing to go to school. They may not want to join in with their friends or peers, might not want to eat, sleep. It may take a very long time before a child is able to actually acknowledge what has happened and believe that their loss is real and be able to move on. So there are very many reactions that we may get to a child who's got a parent in prison, and those are normal reactions, and it's about how we support them through that time. I'm now going to play to you Kyra's story. The statistics that are talked about here are older than what we discussed at the beginning of the presentation, but the content is really still important. This slide shows various ways in which a child can be impacted by a family member being in prison. We know that other children can be cruel and taunt and bully children and cause isolation from their peers. Substance misuse, or perhaps issues around anorexia, bulimia, are usually about the child trying to take some sort of control back in their lives, or perhaps a means of escapism with use of drugs or alcohol. Worrying or not wanting to be at school will impact on educational outcomes for the child, and any truanting can have an impact in the way that they may be involved not only in antisocial behaviour but also issues around exploitation such as CSE and child criminal activity. The fact that a family member may be in prison can impact on the finances of that family, causing stress and financial issues. All of these can impact significantly on the child's mental health and physical well-being. As discussed earlier, it's really important that parents or carers in prison have access to their family, including their children. So it's inevitable that children will take time off from school. If it's after COVID or pre-COVID, that would be to visit them in person. But obviously they will still need time to see them virtually, as very often those visits are arranged in the week. If we're not aware that that child's parent or carer is in prison, those absences are likely to be recorded as an unauthorised absence, and that will impact on the child's attendance record. But also what we know is that when children visit or have a virtual visit, that can impact significantly on them. It might make them very upset, it might have an impact on their concentration. They may get very angry, lash out, so their behaviour deteriorates. And of course, we may not be aware of why that's happening, because actually there is no system in place to notify schools if a parent is admitted to prison. So we may not know what is behind the behaviour that's presenting with that child. So the importance of checking out any behaviours that are concerning are really important, because that's the only way we may get to know of what's going on for that child. But obviously the impact on the education of that child and their outcomes will be significant if we're not involved and understand why they're not behaving as they should be, or interacting, or perhaps getting their work in on time. With a parent in prison, there may be a loss of income for a family, putting that family under increased financial pressure, especially if that person is the main income provider for the family. That obviously may cause substantial financial debt for those people that are left behind. Benefits may stop, they may change, and again that will have significant impact on the family. Just think about the cost of visiting prisons, because very often those people will be put in an area away from where the family live, although every attempt is made to keep local. But if you've got a family member and you live in the West Midlands and they're in London or Manchester, for example, and you don't drive, think about what you've got to do to actually get to a visit. You may have to get up very early in the morning, catch 2 buses to a train station, catch a train, have a long journey, 2-3 hours maybe, to get to the other end, where you may then have to have 2 more bus rides or a taxi to actually just get to the prison for a 2-hour visit. And then there's the repeat journey all the way back. Think about the cost that's involved in that. That will increase pressure on that family who want to still see their loved one and that mum or that dad. But what if you can't afford it? And the pressure then is not only on you but on that person inside who's actually waiting for that visit, because it's all important to them. So the financial impact, yes, we have that, but also the cost emotionally, not only to the child or the carer that's left behind, but to that individual who's in prison. When we're actually looking at the practical impact of somebody being imprisoned, we know that losing the family home is much more likely if mum goes to prison compared with dad. And we've talked about the impact that has on the child, having to move school, lose their peer friendships, etc., and their network of support potentially. But think about what we've just discussed about them going to prison in the last slide. If they're doing a journey that's stressful, if I'm a mom and my husband's in prison and I've got 2 young children and a baby and I've got to make that long journey, think about the hours that I'm going to spend actually doing that visit. It's not just 2 hours, it's another maybe 3-4 hours either end of that, dependent on where the prison is. That in itself will impact on the child, because they'll be tired, they'll be crotchety, they may not have had so much to eat, they may not be able to do their homework for school for the next day. When they've gone into prison, they will have to be searched. They'll be in a situation that they've never experienced before that can be quite frightening, with security guards and people around them that they don't know. They don't know what to expect. And in some places, they're not able to act normally with their child, with their parent. That child isn't perhaps able to get out of the chair even. So they may not be able to hug them, especially where there aren't any family centres and it's a more formal setting. But think about the issue of being searched and having your toys searched if you go into that security area. And we've already talked about disappointment of cancelled visits and the impact that can have. It's quite sobering, isn't it, the facts and actually the implications for children as well as other members of the family. And I think it's quite disgusting to think that we've got no actual process to inform you as a school if a pupil has a parent in prison. I think that's quite a safeguarding issue, because if we are aware, then we can put support services in to assist that child and family. If a child does confide in you that they've got a parent in prison, you should feel quite honoured actually, because that can be really hard for a child to tell, and it means that they trust you. So it's really important that we keep that information on a need-to-know basis, because they could be really distressed and ashamed by it. But because they've spoken to you, talk openly to them, reassure them it's okay to talk to you, but be mindful of the confidentiality of that information. And what we also have to be aware of is if that child is visiting a parent or having contact, they may be tired, they may not be very amenable to being spoken to the next morning, they might not have their homework, and that's possibly because they've done a visit. Obviously with COVID, we're going to have virtual sessions which won't have that travelling time involved, but they still may be unable to concentrate that night or even that whole day or even the day before or after the visit. Because if they haven't seen that individual for a long time, then the excitement of seeing them, but also the worry and the upset, and after the visit feeling really sad and unhappy because they know that they won't see them for a long time again, we need to be mindful of that. So as a school, we need to be flexible. We need to understand that children may need to leave school early if it's to visit a parent in prison or to have a virtual visit, or they might need to come in late. But either way, we shouldn't be recording that as an unauthorised absence. So just be mindful of that need to have some sort of flexibility to accommodate the needs of that child, because it's really important that they're part of that individual's life. Even though that they're in prison doesn't mean to say they're going to lose interest in that child. And you heard earlier, those prisoners that we visited at Redditch were very much saying they really needed their children in their lives, and that was almost something that they could hang on to for when they come out, that child will still be there, will still love them and still be part of the family. So it's really important that we make sure that we allow access, we allow that flexibility so that child can see the person that they love. Sometimes our staff, might be just that person that child wants to speak to. Maybe they feel they can't talk to anybody within the family. They just want somebody who's outside of everything to be able to listen to them, to be able to reassure them and give them advice. So just be mindful that the relationships that we build up as staff with children are really important, not just because of safeguarding issues where parents might be hurting their children, but also where we have a child that has a family member in prison. This William Bear resource is probably more useful for primary school children, but you could perhaps adapt it more so for senior school by putting a different image on the front, etc., and perhaps different wording. But it just is addressed to a teacher, and it says so-and-so has had to go to jail, lots of things have changed. Here are some ideas that you can do. I've ticked the ones I think I need help with. And there are various things on this postcard, like I would like to talk to, and then you could put a name in about what has happened, but I need some help. And then they tick to give you as a school authority to tell other teachers why they might be upset. Help them to have a laugh and have fun. It also allows them to say what they're worried about, and who they want you to send a copy of their school report to, and things like that. So I think this is a really useful resource to use, and it can be found in the Safeguarding in Education resource page on Revolution, along with other things that might be useful for you. This is a recap slide, and I would just like you to be mindful of the issues that face children who have a family member in prison, and especially where that's a mum or a dad, but also the issues that face other family members that have been left behind. It is important that if children feel able to talk to us, then we listen and we aren't judgmental in any shape or format. It will take a lot for a child perhaps to share with you information that they have somebody in prison. They may feel embarrassed or ashamed to do so, but they actually might need you to support them because they feel unable to talk to anybody at home. And that might be because those people left behind are not coping, are worried, sad and happy, and the child can't put any more responsibility onto that individual who is there. So talking to you may be their only way out. Really important that we help them talk through their feelings so we get a judgment of how they are on a day-to-day basis. If they are talking to us, it is confidential information, but we're allowed to share that with our DSL and according to our safeguarding protocols and procedures. But be mindful that you may need to consider an early help assessment, because where there are financial problems, maybe housing problems because of debt, maybe the family can't afford to go to prison if they're able to do so, and we're in a situation that we haven't got COVID anymore, then we may need to think about how we access services and support for that family, and ideally that would be through an early help assessment. And the other point on there is that if children are visiting or need time off to do a virtual visit for a family member, then as a school we have a responsibility to grant that as an authorised absence. This is a charter that has actually been written by children who have family members in prison, and it basically says they want to be informed, they want to know how their family member is, they want to know if they're safe, if they're coping, they want to know where they are and if they're transferred, where they've gone to, and they want to know that quickly, and they want to know what options they have for visits. So what happens if the other parent doesn't want to take them to visit and they want to do that visit? And they also want to know more about the visits process and have people who are trained to speak to them. So that's a children's charter, which is quite useful, I think. This last slide gives you information, and it gives you information around helplines and also web addresses for adults, teenagers and for children where they have questions that they want answering or where they want any advice. The email of prisoner is one way of contacting a loved one in prison. You just have to load up some credit onto the website, and then you can email the person that you have in prison as long as you have their prison number and the prison that they are residing in. And it gives a facility also for you to pay for that individual to email you back. And I think the turnaround time for emails is about 2 days. Also interesting to know is that if you send a letter or a birthday card or perhaps a picture that's been painted by a child, they won't actually get the original items. Those are copied and the prisoner will get the copy of that letter or card, etc. The only way you can actually send a card in is if you send it from somewhere like Moonpig or any of the other places that do the cards that are actually sent from them direct. And my understanding is that's because they have instances where drugs are actually impregnated into paper, and obviously they don't want any of that going on. So just a bit of useful information there. And there is also a website there specifically for schools. So I hope you found the session informative and not too distressing. I think it's really difficult when children have a parent in prison, and all we can do is be there to support and also guide and give information, and if necessary think about early help. It might be that needs to be raised to even child in need or child protection, but if you have a concern about a child, please use your child protection policies and contact your DSL. Many thanks for listening. I hope it's been useful.